So I've wanted to do an in-depth look at the work of Steely Dan for a long while now, as they've been a ubiquitous part of my life since I was born, and it's a topic I can never seem to get bored of talking about. I recently started writing some reviews in my own time, so I figured I may as well turn them into videos as I go. Before I begin, I need to clarify a bit about what I will be covering in this series and how I will be approaching it, mostly for my sake because who else is even going to watch these? Firstly, I think it is a good idea to just give a brief introduction to Steely Dan for those less familiar than me. Steely Dan are a jazz rock band founded by keyboardist Donald Fagen and guitarist and bassist Walter Becker in 1971. For their first few albums, they used a conventional band with a set lineup, before shifting around 1975 to exclusively using session musicians to record their songs. Between the years of 1972 and 1980, Fagen and Becker recorded 7 studio albums. They then took a hiatus before returning in the year 2000 and releasing a further 2. In that 20-year gap, and in the years after their final album together, they also released a combined 6 solo records. Fagen and Becker possess a unique musical and lyrical style, which is in equal parts esoteric and accessible in a way no other band is quite able to capture. A far more in-depth history and profile will of course take shape over the series, but if you like jazz or sarcasm or good pop music, or even just a general feeling of smug superiority for your musical taste, then Steely Dan are the band for you. That's all extremely general, but it's all you need to know for now, and I assume most of you know the basics anyway. So I'm going to make a video on each of the 15 studio albums Fagen and Becker made as Steely Dan or on their own, of course, which isn't too difficult because I know all of those albums so well. What's trickier is that as a Steely Dan superfan, I obviously don't want to miss anything, and this means that I will be going a bit deeper than just the albums. I want to discuss as much as I can, from the songs Fagen and Becker wrote which got recorded by other artists, to outtakes, to demos, to live shows, to covers, and so forth. But of course there is such a thing as being too thorough, and it is a delicate balance. Certain things like live shows and covers I couldn't talk about exhaustively even if I wanted to, and believe me, I don't. So for these topics I'm going to contain it to only particularly notable or interesting things I find worth discussing. For the more manageable obscure topics, I'm going to break them down based on their relationship to official albums. For the rarities that are specifically related to an album, meaning they were recorded for or around the same time as an album's sessions, they will be included in that record's video. To use perhaps the most famous example of a Dan rarity, this means I will talk about the second arrangement in the Gaucho video. This leaves only rarities not related to an album, like the aforementioned live shows and covers as well as the pre-Dan era. Instead of making separate videos on these topics, which would be ridiculous, I'm going to bundle them together based on decade and talk about them, when I have something to say, in a decade overview video which I will make once I reach the end of a decade of albums. To use another example, this means I will bundle everything from the pre-Dan era into one video and make a pre-Dan overview as the first in the series. In this case it isn't an actual decade, but hopefully you get the idea. And hopefully that's that as far as introductions go. But before we can look at their debut record, we have a whole half-decade of pre-Dan material to cover. So that is exactly what I'll be looking at in my first video, before jumping in with their debut record in episode 2. See you all soon.